All right, this is a quick-fire overview of the PAiCE tool. So what we see here is the starting point where we have all of the training materials that are recorded and all of the promotional materials that are recorded. And we have everything that's hyperlinked through. We have the ability to have in multiple languages at the moment. We have English, Vietnamese, and Khmer. There was a Spanish version, but it needs to be updated. We have a user guide that basically describes how we use the tool, including yellow boxes where we need to fill things to progress, and a few user notes that come in as well. That leads us to the pre-module, module O, where we're essentially setting up the ability for the tool to know what we're talking about. So if what this will look like is like this, you'll see these yellow boxes with red text, and then we have these drop downs. And when you answer, new questions emerge. So that's how the functionality of the tool works. So in this case, we've pre-filled with some data from the Cambodian Mekong Delta. So that we can create shapefiles or otherwise, we asked for the geographical locations, so the cardinal points, the countries, the districts, subnational areas that are involved. And then because the tool works on a aerial basis, on a hectare basis, we ask about the actual number of hectares that we're talking about. So that's module O. That leads us to the true first module, which is module S. S is for system or system characterization. So here what we do is we ask how many crops we are discussing, and then we get some information of the name and the type of crop that we have. We also then ask for seasons. So in this case, we've got 2 crops by 3 seasons, and we take the aerial extent, and that essentially gives us the number of hectares in each season under different crops. For those crops by season combinations, we then ask for the current yield, the income per tonne, and the gross margin per hectare, and we get our first results. And that is essentially the economic value of each of the crops by season combinations. We also have the ability to toggle it if you're in a different currency than US dollars, and with the units that come as well. So in this example, if we toggle to millions or thousands, you'll see everything update. So that's where we get to with the first module, which is about characterizing the system. As we move on from there, what we have is a filter function. So there's a couple of things that we look at here. The first one is which version of the tool are we running? So we have the ability to run for production constraints and climate challenges only, or ideally to be run in unison. So this is set up at the moment to run both production constraints and climate challenges. In this particular pre-fill, we have those combinations of crops. This is where we choose which crop combinations we actually want to analyze throughout the tool. And then we have 5 environmental constraints that are important in the particular location. So this is essentially setting up the pre-work for what the tool does and what it analyzes. So in this case, we have said that we're running with production constraints. So what we're doing here to understand the production constraints in each production domain, we have, we have these different key global agronomic production challenges. So across soil, organic resources, crop genetics, tillage, pests and disease, water management, cropping system management, and harvest, and then the subcategories. So we're then asked to select the top 10 production constraints that come in with some different drop-down menus that come, and then put some notes in. And what we're then doing is saying for these top production constraints, we want to look at that by the crop by season combinations and understand what the impact is of these different production constraints. So in this example, we're talking about rice in the wet season, and we're understanding what the impact of residue burning is in this production domain, which is the Cambodian Mekong Delta. Now, what you're seeing here is junk data, but the idea is that we can quantify the loss that's occurring by understanding the different impacts of these production constraints across not impacted, mildly, moderately, heavily, and very heavily. So in each of these modules, sub-modules, you'll get this rapid calculation of approximate economic loss. You can see here that random crop geometry is coming in first. So if we come over, it's because we've got some quite high numbers that are here around impact. So that's repeated for the different production constraints that come in. And what we get at the end of this module then is a summary of the top production constraints. So this is by crop and season, and then this is aggregated by crop, and then that's aggregated by the actual production constraints. So in the junk data that was put in, low planting density is the #1 production constraint, followed by late planting and random crop geometry. So this gives us an understanding of what we need to adapt for in terms of production constraints. We then move into Module C, which is about climate challenges. Same sort of concept. We first set up what are the climate challenges, the top 10 climate challenges. So from our drop-down list, temperature, excessive water, insufficient water, radiation, storm, cyclones, or other, and then putting some details and notes around that. And then for what seasons do they come in? Because all climate challenges will be related to all seasons. So there's a filter there when we go forward and ask. So same format again. We then ask for rice in the wet season. We have these climate challenges. What's the percentage area that's likely to be impacted by these climate challenges? And then we have our incidence times severity. So we're saying in the next 10 years, how often do we expect each of these to have an impact or to occur? And then when it does happen, what sort of yield loss are we having? So again, we get these calculations as we go. So for rice in the wet season, with this data, which is true data from Cambodia, we see that drought in the EWS season and longer dry spells is the #1, but then we also have heavy rains in that dry season as well. And then insect, pest, and disease, as you can see, very low percentage area impacted, and then when it does, it's not actually having a big impact. So we do that again. So in this example, rice in the dry season, rice in the EWS, maize in the wet, maize in the dry, and then we go to our results. So what we're seeing there is the most impactful climate challenges disaggregated. So in this case, we've got the challenge and the season and the crop, and then we can aggregate by season, we can aggregate by crop, and we can aggregate by the climate challenges themselves. So in this case, we're going to see that there's 2 climate challenges that are almost equal in their severity. We also then can have a look at vulnerability. So if we look at it just from the crop by season combination or crop by season, so what we can see here is that the wet season is by far the most vulnerable to what we perceive to be the climate challenges. And again, rice being the most vulnerable based on the inputs of data that come before. So that's what our output looks like for everything that should, in theory, be pre-populated before the workshop, before we move into the actual workshop setting. Up to this point, we hope that that's been pre-populated with data sources prior to. Where the data isn't available, some locations choose to have that as part of their workshop, but it means that their workshop needs to go a little bit longer in order to pre-populate that. So then we move to the workshop starting point. So this is something that would be up at the start of the workshop. It just goes through some of the information around what we're trying to solve for, the approach that we take, what we get at the end, some acknowledgements and citations. So that's what you would have up when people are walking in, etc. Because this is pre-populated, then what we do is pull across some of those different summaries. So the saying this is how we filled it in. So in this case, 2 crops, 5 combinations of crop by season. We can estimate the economically important crops, we can estimate the key production constraints, and we can estimate the key climate challenges that come in the workshop. And that's all from hopefully pre-populated data. What we then do is come in, we note down workshop participants and who they are. We're doing this in groups of 4 to 7, essentially. And we start with our module A, which is our adaptation. So we start with a long list. We say that these are our top production constraints and most impactful climate challenges. And we're saying that we need to solve for these. we have different categories of adaptation over here. So resilient cultivars, cropping calendar, water management, tillage and crop establishment, soil health and crop residues, climate responsive nutrient management, cropping system diversification and agroforestry, integrated management of biotic threats, harvest and post-harvest management, and the capture all other. So you can nominate up to 3 different options for each of these, making the long list a list of up to 30, I believe. So you put between 0 and 3 in each of these. It comes up and it asks for the names of these. So the idea is that we have a long list of what might be suitable for adaptation given these climate challenges and production constraints. We then move to a short list. So in this case, in the long list, we've nominated 18 different adaptation options. What we then do is we can either include them directly. So in this case, these 3 options were included directly. We excluded crop rotation, and we put a reason for that. And then some of these were actually merged. So this is data from the Cambodian workshop where they had nominated a few different tolerant varieties. So they just merged that into one. They had mechanized planting that came in for transplanting and DSR. The idea here is you either start your bundling process now or just things that came up in discussion that we know have to go together. So from this, you create a list of up to 10 adaptation options that can be fully analysed, and that's where we then go in. So as we do this, what we see is how we are actually going to evaluate these different adaptation options. So the first point is to understand. So we're evaluating here tolerant varieties. How do new tolerant varieties address existing production constraints? So we've got the top production constraints listed in a crop by season fashion, and we're asking, are these production constraints impacted by the adoption of tolerant varieties? So yes or no. Where we say yes, we want to understand the yield gain that comes and the change in costs of implementation, because some can be positive or negative. And we do that for production constraints across mildly, moderately, heavily, and very heavily impacted areas. The second component then is around the impact of the adaptation option, in this case, tolerant varieties, around future climate challenges. So again, we have our key climate challenges in a crop by season fashion, and we ask, is there an impact? If there is, what is the yield gain and what is the change in implementation cost? So those are the heavy numbers, and we use the pre-populated data in terms of the area impacted, the current yield, the value of per tonne, margins, etc., to calculate the economic benefit of these different adaptation options. From there, we also create a context score. So asking around the current perception and awareness, the current level of adoption and adoption ceiling, the research context, so what's the evidence base, is it ready to go now? How does it address the key environmental concerns that we have? What are the implications on farmers in terms of how easy it is to adopt? Are there any key issues like upfront costs, scarcity of labour, that it requires more labour? Does it require new skills? And how long does it take to receive benefit? We talk about co-benefits there around system sustainability and climate change mitigation. We obviously don't want to preference things that make the situation worse. We talk about inclusivity around women and girls and around marginalised populations, and we talk about the context in relation to government and private sector. What's the relationship and how important is it for those two separate entities to actually contribute for success to occur? So we do that same template over the nominated adaptation options, and we get to a point where we get to our results. So the way that the results occur is that you pick your units and currency, and then we assign weighting. So obviously there's some economics here around the value of adaptation, but there's also this idea that context is important as well. So you can place emphasis and weightings on different components to get a final score. So in this case, there's equal weighting provided to the need for further research and development, the appropriate context, the adoption constraints, the enabling environment, and to social inclusion. And then we've got to weight those contextual scores against the potential economic benefit to the region. So we've got a little thing here, as we can see with these numbers. The potential economic benefit is 70%, and then all of these are lower. So let's say, for instance, that we weren't particularly concerned with adoption constraints because we know we have money for promotion. So if we change that to 0, then the weighting changes down here. And if we weren't that concerned around, hypothetically, social inclusion, we put that at 10%. But we wanted these contextual factors to be worth more. So we're just adjusting here. So this is a really important discussion that we talked around about different people, different organizations have different weightings that come in once you get the final results as well. So in this case, let's just put some of these back to more realistic numbers. And we'll go 60-40 here. So you can see all that updating. And then we get to our results. So we get these by solving production constraints, solving climate challenges, and then solving both of those challenges together. So this is what the output looks like. So we get a list of the top 20. This is adaptation options to solve specific production constraints. So we've got a potential of adaptation option in $1 million US. We've got the comparative economic potential. So that's what comes first and last. And then we've got our comparative contextual score and our full score. So in this case, overcome low plant density for rice in the dry season, rice and non-rice crops are the solution, the top solution based on the weighting. So remember, this is junk data for production constraints. What it also does is identify some particular concerns that might be relevant when you're considering and evaluating different options. So in this case, the evidence base is not ready. It's not ready to go yet. It has negative consequences for some of the key environmental concerns, etc., etc. So it gives you a matrix here to say, if we're going to move ahead with this adaptation option, we're going to have to look at some of these issues. So this is presented in a challenge scenario, as in what's production constraint, the crop and the season, but we also can aggregate that up to the best adaptation for the different production domains. So we can do that for production constraints. We also do that for climate adaptation, and then we do it together. So that's what the outputs look like. We then just have some limitations in the next step. So it talks about workflow around what the tool does and doesn't do. There's the ability to click back here on some clarifications for definitions as well. And then you get a printout summary. So it's set up so that it fits on an A4 page where it spits out all of the different things that the tool has learned about a particular production area. So that's the very quickest I can give you in the overview of what the PAiCE tool, the full PAiCE tool, actually does.